Hatfield House, in the rural heart of Hertfordshire, is...
Born in Greenwich Palace, London, came here when she was 3 months old and lived here for 25 years until the day she became Queen of England and Queen of Ireland.
As soon
Hatfield House, in the rural heart of Hertfordshire, is one of Britain's finest...
Oak, which is the royal family, coming down from Elizabeth I.
Hatfield House, in the rural heart of Hertfordshire, is one of Britain's finest stately homes.
It's gilded, it's grand, it's even grander than Buckingham Palace.
And the childhood home of Britain's most famous queen.
Hatfield really is where Elizabeth I is created.
Its opulent rooms and glorious gardens have witnessed dark rumours.
Sexual scandal could be deadly, literally deadly.
Sibling rivalry.
if we think Harry and William are having a hard time, we don't even know the start of it.
And betrayal.
At the age of 3, her mother is executed. Her father orders her mother to be beheaded.
Hatfield really reflects the Tudor succession story, and heaven knows it is a story and a half.
For 500 years, Hatfield has played host to kings, queens, and Hollywood royalty, and sparked ideas and inventions that changed the world.
The coming of the jet age, the invention of this plane that could fly above the clouds and fly so fast, it changed everything.
Through good times.
This reaches a climax in this unbelievable feast. A roast boar would arrive stuffed by a panda, or, I'm exaggerating there, but you never know.
And bad times.
Was the candle flaring before it went out, before the First World War really obliterates this way of life.
From Elizabeth I to Charles III, Hatfield has been at the heart of British and royal life.
Some of the most important events in British history happened at Hatfield.
With privileged access to Hatfield House, this is the behind-the-scenes story of a palace built for the pursuit of pleasure and power. A house which changed the course of history. In June 2012, Hatfield House welcomed the latest in a long line of monarchs to pass through its gates.
As the Queen arrives here at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, a truly memorable moment for the crowds who've gathered to congratulate her on her Diamond Jubilee. Whilst here, the Queen will plant a commemorative tree, something permanent for generations to come.
Elizabeth II, who in her lifetime personally planted 1,500 trees all over the world, many of them oaks, she ceremonially plants another oak tree.
Once inside Hatfield Park, and much to the delight of the considerable crowds, the Queen planted the Diamond Jubilee tree.
But this was no ordinary oak. This was a replacement for a tree of truly historic significance, forever linked to another long-serving queen.
It's allegedly under an oak tree in Hatfield in November 1558 that Elizabeth I hears that her sister Queen Mary I has died and she is now Queen of England and Ireland, and utters the phrase from the Psalm, "This is the Lord's doing and it is marvellous in our eyes," which doesn't seem like the most affectionate response to your sister dying, but perhaps quite an understandable reaction to becoming queen.
In fact, there is no hard evidence that Elizabeth was sitting under an oak tree. It's highly unlikely. We all know that the weather's foul in England in November. But why does this apocryphal story take root? Because the sturdy oak, that idea of Englishness, something that will endure. You can't get something more solid and reliable than the oak tree.
Like the oaks in its grounds, Hatfield House has stood firm for over 500 years. Its red brick walls have witnessed empires rise and fall, and kings and queens come and go.
The thing about Hatfield House's royal history is that it's history. I mean, not just sort of like the royals were here, but royal stuff happening at Hatfield like you wouldn't believe. The Royal Association is so massive, it's kind of inescapable.
Today, Hatfield House is home to the 7th Marquess and Marchioness of Salisbury, whose family have owned the estate for over 400 years. But Hatfield has also been home to at least 3 Elizabeth IIs, 3 Duke of Edinburghs, Queen Anne, and Wonder Woman.
We have a variety of films, period dramas, TV have filmed here fairly regularly over the last 20 years. We have 11,000 acres of parkland, beautiful woodland, and we also have the Old Palace and the church. So they've all at some point featured in one film or another.
Even if you've never been to Hatfield, the chances are you've already seen it. The library has been Lara Croft's mansion in Tomb Raider. The Long Gallery, Catherine the Great's palace. And the King James Drawing Room is a regular body double for Britain's royal palaces.
Hatfield House becomes the Hollywood vision of what a British palace should actually look like. Because, of course, the reality of our palaces is that they're actually quite scruffy and they're quite ordinary in many ways.
And even Buckingham Palace, behind its grand exterior, is surprisingly normal.
I remember taking a group of international wallpaper retailers around, and I think it was the Russian delegation were looking around and go, "This is terrible, I wouldn't put my staff in here, what's this shoddy place?" Because it was all a bit old money, it was all a bit down at heel, and, you'd have these incredibly ornate John Nash fireplaces with like a 5-bar electric fire plugged into it, because that's what our royal family's like, that's what they're like. So actually, if you're a casting agent for the Crown and you're looking around for somewhere to be Buckingham Palace, you don't go to Buckingham Palace. Whereas Hatfield House, my goodness me, that absolutely fits the bill.
Masquerading as Buckingham Palace, Hatfield House has been seen by a global audience of millions, thanks to our insatiable appetite for royal intrigue.
We're all a nation of gossips, really, aren't we? We particularly want to know what goes on behind palace walls, because there is this cloak of mystery about life in palaces.
But the drama on screen is nothing in comparison to the real-life royal drama that's taken place at Hatfield House over the centuries. Most of all, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I.
It's a very, very tumultuous time, and Elizabeth Tudor is living the whole of this time really at Hatfield.
Coming up, the ultimate toxic family.
We complain about dysfunction in our modern royal family, but that's not even on a par with what Henry was doing.
Bloodshed.
She's condemned after a show trial and beheaded in London.
And scandal.
It's alleged that she's been sleeping with her stepfather.
Hatfield House in Hertfordshire is one of Britain's most magnificent historic residences.
This is a palace in all but royal name.
Today, Hatfield boasts not one, but two historic houses. There's the actual royal residence, a rather modest Tudor palace, and a considerably more lavish 17th century Jacobean stately home, where many a king and queen have stayed. 40 acres of gardens, 273 richly decorated rooms, and more lavatories than anyone can count.
When you go to Hatfield, there is something so theatrical about it. You start at the front door if you are a worthy guest. I mean, obviously, if you're not a worthy guest, you're around the back, and, but you're taken into a series of spaces along a processional route. You walk from one space to another as if it's one stage set to another.
First on the tour is the majestic Marble Hall.
This is an absolutely perfect mint example of what super luxe Jacobean style looks like. One of the things that I can't escape from whenever I look at the Marble Hall and I look at that floor, I can't escape from thinking that's a giant chessboard.
Next comes the spectacular carved oak staircase.
Every time you stop, you notice something different. You've got the statues, curls and volutes and funny little figures. You've got the grotesque work, which is absolute cutting-edge decoration.
Having climbed the stairs, the very worthiest of guests could take a walk in the 170-foot-long gallery.
Someone worked out that having a stroll around the grounds in all that velvet and that enormous codpiece was often something you couldn't do because of the incredibly inclement weather. Nothing smells more doggy than wet velvet. So they started building long galleries where you could take a bit of exercise undercover. But the long gallery at Hatfield, it's like it's a long gallery, but someone's absolutely turned the volume up on it. There is more there. There's luxe there. There's opulenza there to a level that you don't normally get. All of it is just absolutely extraordinary.
It has some of the greatest portraits and paintings anywhere in the world, and it's still owned by the same family that built it. It's kind of the whole of English history in a remarkable building.
Hatfield House is more than a record of that history. It helped to shape history by nurturing the young woman who would become England's most celebrated queen.
Elizabeth I was one of the most famous and remarkable monarchs in British and world history. And this is the reign which begins what some see as England, Britain's imperial greatness. Obviously a mixed and complicated legacy, but there's no doubt that Elizabeth Gloriana was a very, very remarkable woman.
Her story began at Hatfield, with a bloody family battle for England's throne.
Hatfield really is the Tudor succession story, and heaven knows it is a story and a half.
This was the original family drama, with more scheming than Succession, more backstabbing than Game of Thrones, and it played out in Hatfield's red brick Tudor palace.
We're standing in the old palace of Hatfield, the former home of Queen Elizabeth I. Born in Greenwich Palace, London, came here when she was 3 months old and lived here for 25 years until the day she became Queen of England and Queen of Ireland.
As soon as baby Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the uber-controversial second wife of Henry VIII, is christened, she is then scuttled up to the old palace at Hatfield. And this becomes effectively her nursery. It's where she spends the majority of her childhood.
More than 400 years later, Elizabeth's presence at Hatfield can still be felt. On display in the Long Gallery are a hat, stockings, and gloves said to have been worn by the Virgin Queen herself. And presiding over the marble hall is one of the Queen's most iconic portraits.
So this is the famous rainbow portrait of Elizabeth I. This was painted sort of around the 1600s, and it took about 10 years to be finished. We had some conservation work recently, and we know that it was actually finished after she died, so it was more of a celebration of what a brilliant queen she was.
It's the most splendid and spectacular image, and it's been recently restored so that when you see her bodice, you can see the actual plants which are embroidered onto it. You can see an acorn, again the symbolism of oaks, and it's full of mythology. The jewels she's wearing, the snake on her arm, which symbolises wisdom.
Pearls represent purity. This was a woman wedded to God and her country. The now faded rainbow clutched in her hand tells us the Queen has brought peace after a storm. But all eyes are quite literally on her gown.
In her robes are these astonishing eyes and ears, different colours, perhaps modelled on different people, that show that she is all-seeing. Everything in it is reeks of symbolism.
The Queen's vigilance, made famous by her notorious spy network, was the legacy of a lifetime spent in fear. Fear that took root at Hatfield.
If she takes the wrong step, makes the wrong move, has the wrong friends, flirts with the wrong person, she could be killed. She could be in the Tower. It may seem a rather placid place, Hatfield, when you go there now, but Elizabeth's life was in danger through much of that childhood.
That danger came from within her own family.
We have ideas of a royal family and ideas of what a family might mean, and they meant something very, very different in these dark times.
Her father beheaded her mother.
I mean, we complain about dysfunction in our modern royal family, but that's not even on a par with what Henry was doing.
Her brother accused her of adultery and treason.
A government official was sent to Hatfield to interrogate Elizabeth, and it was an interrogation. Her servants were taken away, sent to the Tower. Her papers were examined. She herself, these pounding questions. And she was still a teenager, mid-teens. She must have been terrified because, of course, Anne Boleyn's daughter knew no one better that sexual scandal, there was always a political element to it in Tudor England, and the combination could be deadly, literally deadly.
Then, in 1554, her sister, Queen Mary, accused Elizabeth of plotting against her and sent the young princess to the Tower of London.
Elizabeth knows if you're in the Tower, that could lead to execution and death, because that's what's happened to her own mother, Anne Boleyn.
Elizabeth's only defense against her toxic family was her intelligence. honed during her schooling at Hatfield Palace.
Hatfield really is where Elizabeth I is created. It's where she becomes Elizabeth, the Elizabeth that we know. She has an immensely thorough education there. And so Elizabeth answers all the questions against her with immense thoroughness and the intelligence that she will become famous for. And so Queen Mary, to her frustration, can't prove Elizabeth was involved. And eventually she's shipped off back to the countryside.
Back in the relative safety of Hatfield, away from the eyes and ears of her enemies in London, Elizabeth began to plot her revenge.
As it became apparent that her half-sister Mary was likely to die without heir, and that Elizabeth herself would be the next queen, Elizabeth at Hatfield began plotting, planning, with the help of the man who would become her great minister, William Cecil. And there's no doubt at all that when Mary finally died, November 1558, Elizabeth had effectively a shadow court in waiting.
So when news of her sister's death reached Elizabeth under that now legendary oak tree, she was ready to rule.
The day after Elizabeth was told that her sister had died and she was Queen of England, she held her first council meeting in what we now call the banqueting house, the Old Palace of Hatfield, the part of the Old Palace that is still standing.
And it was in this great hall, with her advisor William Cecil, that Elizabeth, the new Queen of England, charted a course that would transform Britain and the world.
I can never believe when I go into that huge room, under the rafters, what that room has seen. It's the beginning of the reign of what, to me, as to so many, is our greatest monarch. And it's the beginning of a whole new age for England, for Britain, and for what would become the Empire, for better or for worse.
Elizabeth had triumphed, overcoming her toxic family. But she still relied on that family and its history to legitimize her authority, as did her namesake Elizabeth II 350 years later.
The Queen was very aware of her lineage, of the history of the monarchy, very much like her racehorses. She traced back for generations, so she traced back her family for generations.
Elizabeth I traced her family back even further, back to the first family in history.
We're looking at an amazing scroll produced in 1559, in other words, the year after Elizabeth came to the throne. It's 22 yards long, so it's the length of a cricket pitch. And it was to show, considering there was some, shall we say, controversy about her legitimacy, very much to show her background and how she was related to Adam and Eve.
According to the scroll, Elizabeth's other illustrious, if not entirely believable, ancestors include King Arthur, Julius Caesar, and Noah.
It's all down to the royal family wanting that history to be part of the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II once said to me, "I walk hand in hand with God." And I said, "Your Majesty, what do you mean by that?" She said, "Well, Paul, on the day I was crowned queen underneath that canopy and anointed with the holy oil, I actually felt the presence of God." That is pretty incredible.
Coming up, at Hatfield, Prince Philip takes to the skies.
away from the stiffs in Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Philip is a pig in you-know-what up there.
Queen Victoria takes tea.
Victoria's terribly greedy. I mean, she was a real gobbler. She absolutely loved her food.
And a popular saying takes root.
That's where the true story of Bob's your uncle came from. "400 years ago, the old palace at Hatfield in Hertfordshire witnessed the beginning of the Elizabethan Golden Age. But in the 1950s, Hatfield House heralded a new Elizabethan age, the Jet Age.
Good news from the air with the public preview of the de Havilland Comet, the world's first all-jet airliner. 4 jet engines provide the power that could take the Comet from London to New York in 6 hours, and here's takeoff number 1.
The Comet was designed, made and tested just a few minutes from Hatfield House, at Hatfield Aerodrome.
It's from there that Prince Philip takes his first jet flight, and later, once he's satisfied they're safe enough, it's where his wife, Elizabeth II, takes her first jet flight.
In June 1953, less than a month after her coronation, the Queen joined the jet set, flying from Hatfield on a special demonstration of the de Havilland Comet.
For the royal family, the coming of the jet age changed everything. The Queen had used aircraft before, but it took, 24 hours to get to Nairobi, for example. And all of a sudden, life was opening up, the world was opening up, and she could visit remote parts of the Commonwealth far more easily.
Elizabeth II will become the most travelled head of state in history, and it will change her relationship with the world. It no longer requires month or week-long voyages to go somewhere. You can do it overnight. And that's how we see Elizabeth II becoming one of the most photographed and visible people in history.
For the royal family, jet travel, pioneered at Hatfield, made the world smaller. But for their staff, it didn't necessarily make royal travel any easier.
There's an incredible operation which springs when the royals are on the move. Everything from bottles of water, because the Queen never drank tap water anywhere she went, extra blankets in case she was cold, pillows. Of course, the Queen never slept on anyone else's pillow. She had to sleep on her own. Linens for the beds, silverware, furniture, rugs, paintings. You name it, it travelled.
Somehow, this excess baggage was squeezed onto the plane, along with dozens of royal staff and journalists.
She visited almost every corner of this globe, and I visited a lot with her, I have to say. It's not like taking an ordinary scheduled flight.
Not least because the pilot was often Prince Philip himself.
How many times did I see Prince Philip get out of his seat on board the Queen's flight and push the pilot out of his seat so that he could fly the plane?
He's like sort of Biggles. Being a bit of a racer. And we know even in late old age, Philip's having car crashes and not wearing a seatbelt. God knows what went on up there. That's all I'm saying.
The atmosphere on a royal aircraft with the Queen's flight was like a country house party the moment you took off, and everybody was in like country house casuals, quaffing wine and eating delicious food.
Her Majesty would occasionally pop through the curtain and say, "Is everybody all right down there?" And of course they'd all stand up and bow and, "Yes, Your Majesty, of course, Your Majesty." Half of them were half cut.
But these high-altitude hijinks were tame compared to the social events hosted at Hatfield. In fact, this is a house purpose-built for partying. After Elizabeth I's death in 1603, King James inherited Hatfield's Tudor palace, But he almost immediately swapped it for a bigger, better house belonging to the son of Elizabeth's trusted counsellor, William Cecil. Like his father, Robert Cecil was a mover and shaker, and as Secretary of State and Lord Treasurer, he became one of Britain's richest men. He decided Hatfield's Tudor palace just wasn't good enough. He needed something grander.
So Cecil arrived out here, and he thought to himself, you know what? If the king doesn't want this palace, I don't want it.
The Cecils gut Hatfield like a fish. They get rid of most of the Tudor interior and exterior architecture. They are looking at it as dated, outworn, sometimes shoddily constructed, a bit busy behind the time. It's just a bit naff from the Stuart perspective. So they get rid of it.
Out went pointy roofs and small windows. In came flat roofs and big windows.
They had huge windows because windows were ridiculously modern. Glass was like, whoa, fabulous, sort of incredible new material.
With money no object, Robert Cecil imported this new style from Renaissance Italy.
So rather than the local builder, you can imagine, being shown a picture of what the Renaissance looks like, and he's, oh, it's a big job. I ain't got anything like that on my van. Actually, he's getting, Mr. Schmanz or Signor Schmancy Pancy over from Firenze to actually do the marble carving himself. Cecil wants the best. And so in a very kind of footballer's wives way, he's getting super duper top flight Italiano design into his house.
In the shadow of what remained of Hatfield's old Tudor palace, Cecil set out to build a house that was more palatial than the finest royal palace, inside and out.
The family wanted to spend the same amount of money developing the landscape around the house as they did on the house. So it's huge, £40,000 at the time. They invested so heavily, and they invested in such knowledgeable people. So the landscape was very elaborate. It would have been a glorious sight to see.
But these 17th century gardens are a mystery.
Unfortunately, there aren't plans. The plans are gone. So what we're looking at today is much more the second Marquess's imitation.
But we do know that the gardens would have been bursting with rare and exotic plants, thanks to Hatfield's first head of parks and gardens, John Tradescant the Elder.
He is the absolute Monty Don of the day. He's a rock star gardener.
John Tradescant the Older was one of the very first plant hunters, and part of that was Tradescant, father and son, going and plant hunting in Europe, in the Middle East, and actually in the Caribbean.
In a way, it's the great untold story of the Elizabethan age, is the change, the revolution in gardens and in the plants that so many of us now think of as being archetypally British, weren't known here until the latter part of the Elizabethan age.
Hatfield's transformation cost the Cecils £18 million in today's money. But it wasn't done simply for the sake of fashion. They were investing in their family's future.
It's not just because this is a courtier showing off. The whole point was to create something on a regal scale.
Because this wasn't simply a home for the Cecils. It was part of a deal, an unwritten contract between Britain's monarchy and aristocracy.
On one hand, you give your aristocrats the plum jobs like Treasury. With it comes enormous income. On the other hand, that income is going to go into building vast houses of the kind the king expects to see. Because if you undersold it, if you made a puny house and said, well, welcome, Your Majesty, what are your job prospects going to be?
But the king didn't just expect to see Cecil's new house. He expected to stay in it too, because the royal family liked nothing more than an all-expenses-paid stay at someone else's home.
Then he would go and hang out with a very, very wealthy courtier and basically say, look, you pick up the bill for a couple of months. I'd been subbing you, now it's your turn to sub me.
So Robert Cecil had little choice but to build a house fit for a king to visit whenever he wished.
Hatfield House was built as a place to accommodate the monarchy. It's got 2 sets of royal apartments, and the king and the queen would each have a symmetrical suite on the first floor.
But it wasn't just the king who came to stay. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of royal hangers-on had to be fed and entertained too.
What the aristocratic families do in receiving royalty is put on pageants in their halls and in their gardens and on their lakes with boats and expensive entertainments for the royal family and all of their entourage, and have to feed them. Terrifying thing to do. It can break a family to keep a royal entourage in your house for a fortnight.
But for Cecil, this was a price worth paying. In return for a fancy B&B fit for a king, plus his considerable political skill, Robert Cecil was elevated to the aristocracy in 1605 as the first Earl of Salisbury.
The Cecils, who only 2 generations earlier had been a minor landed court family, are now one of the great houses of the English aristocracy.
The Cecils became known as the Salisburys, and Hatfield House a magnet for multiple monarchs. But the most memorable and expensive royal visit came in October 1846, when another formidable queen came to stay.
Queen Victoria is an avid reader of historical non-fiction. She is particularly obsessed with the Tudors and the Stuarts, so Hatfield is a must for her.
Victoria wanted to see the famous oak where, it was said, her predecessor had been sitting when they told her that her sister Mary was dead and she was Queen of England.
The oak tree was still alive. Just. Victoria was presented with an acorn for her gardeners to grow, which sadly failed to germinate. Her pilgrimage completed, it was time for Queen Victoria, the Marquis of Salisbury, and over 500 other guests to party.
And I think for Salisbury, what he wanted to do was to do a feast along the lines of the sort of crazy, extraordinary, slightly surreal stuff that the Elizabethans went in for, where you had, you know, a roast boar that would arrive and someone would cut it and there'd be a flight of doves, or, you know, you'd have a peacock and you know, which was then stuffed by a panda, or, you know, I'm exaggerating there, but you never know.
Even without a panda, the catering bill for Victoria's 2-day visit came to an eye-watering £75,000 in today's money.
And in fact, Salisbury nearly bankrupted himself on the amount of turtles he was serving, because, of course, turtles were very much the thing at the time.
After gorging on this gargantuan feast, the guests somehow managed to climb the stairs to the long gallery, where they danced until the early hours.
This really is a moment in which you see Hatfield taking its place in this golden twilight of the British aristocracy. It's one of the houses that's hosting these grand country house weekends where politics are still discussed. Many political careers are made or broken.
Among those careers was that of the third Marquis of Salisbury, Robert Arthur Talbot Gascoigne Cecil, 3 times British Prime Minister between 1885 and 1902, and the only British Prime Minister in history to sport a beard.
He ran the empire for 16 years from Hatfield House. He never once stayed in number 10 in London. Why live in a pokey flat in London when you've got Hatfield House?
The bushy-faced Marquis has another even greater claim to fame, thanks to his habit of keeping it in the family.
Salisbury is known for promoting family members or family friends into his cabinet.
Among those to benefit was Salisbury's relatively inexperienced nephew, Arthur Balfour. When he was appointed to the cabinet, commentators claimed it was solely because the Prime Minister was his uncle.
The Marquis of Salisbury, his name, like many of the Cecils, is Robert. Allegedly, that's where the phrase "Bob's your uncle" comes from, because that's how you got a place in the cabinet.
Coming up, a future king goes green in Hatfield's gardens.
She's reputed to have been the one who told him to talk to his plants.
500 years on from Elizabeth I, the royal bond remains unbroken.
There is a direct link between Hatfield and the present House of Windsor.
And a mechanized killing machine descends on Hatfield.
The modern world has come to Hatfield in a brutal and very vivid way.
Hatfield House in Hertfordshire was built for the pursuit of pleasure and power.
Hatfield is the centre of politics, administration, economy, and social life for centuries.
As such, it's been a magnet for Britain's monarchy since the reign of Elizabeth I.
Charles I in 1647, during the Civil War, came under guard to Hatfield and was entertained in the house. George III was a great friend of the then Marquis of Salisbury and came on a big visit in 1800 with the royal family. And there's the famous visit in 1846 for 3 days of Victoria and Albert, where vast amounts of money was spent.
Next came King George V. But when he visited Hatfield in early 1916, it wasn't for pleasure or for politics.
These manicured gardens that have been used to host parties and entertain the influential figures of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, they're torn up to test tanks for the Western Front.
Secluded and private, yet just 20 miles from London, Hatfield was the perfect place to test this top-secret new weapon.
By cover of darkness, this new war machine arrives on a train, stopping about 2 miles outside the train station at Hatfield, and is unloaded and brought across the estate. And this is the first ever tank.
The Prime Minister and Secretary of State for War gathered at Hatfield to watch the world's first tank be put through its paces. A week later, the King himself came to see the new war machine, and even ventured inside for a spin round what was once the golf course.
It was a great success. So the tanks were rolling up and down this lovely estate, and by golly, what a difference it made to the success of the war.
The tank revolutionized warfare, but it didn't end the war. That would take another 2 years and cost the lives of 140 Hatfield men and 5 members of the Cecil family.
The First World War blows apart the entire system on which the aristocracy had been based.
The war killed the heirs to many grand estates, alongside the workers who kept those estates running.
The aristocracy will never again enjoy the security and privilege that had characterized that Victorian period.
But eventually, Hatfield's gardens were returned to their former glory. In the 1980s, these gardens had a profound effect on the future King Charles, thanks to their restoration masterminded by the 6th Marchioness, Molly Salisbury.
The gardens that you see immediately in front of the house are Molly Salisbury's inspiration. She decided to recreate how it would have looked long ago, because the gardens got pretty well trashed during the First World War, and she wanted to put them back to their magnificent splendour. Probably the most impressive is the Knott Garden. It's wonderfully symmetrical and geometric, and it looks like a piece of fabulous Tudor embroidery. There's a mini maze in one part. There's a central fountain, and there's box hedges all around in beautiful patterns. It really is fabulous.
The then Prince Charles was captivated.
Charles looked up to Molly Salisbury enormously because partly she was a pioneer of organic gardening. Many decades ago, she decided to not use pesticides, insecticides in any way. And that was his inspiration, I think, for starting his own organic garden at Highgrove. And he sought advice from her and guidance from her.
Today, King Charles is a passionate advocate of organic gardening and farming. And this may not have been the only idea Charles took from Hatfield's so-called green goddess.
She's reputed to have been the one who told him to talk to his plants, for which he was roundly mocked for a long time. And she says, well, actually, I didn't tell him that, but I did tell him that loving and cherishing your plants really makes all the difference.
He may or may not talk to plants, but like so many of his ancestors, it seems King Charles does talk to the Cecil family, now more commonly known as the Marquesses of Salisbury.
The Cecils have been servants and friends of British monarchs, really going back to Tudor times, and really that continues. Most of the Earls and Marquesses of Salisbury have been Knights of the Garter, including the present Marquess of Salisbury, made a Knight of the Garter in 2019. He was instrumental in the Diamond Jubilee celebrations of the late Queen. So there's always been this link between the Cecils and the royals, and it's a personal link and it's an official link. And to this day, the Salisburys are friends of the royals, as it were, and servants of the state.
The royal roots at Hatfield House run deep, back through 5 centuries of high-flying and high living, through good times and bad, back to that oak tree in the grounds.
Hatfield House is an incredibly important link to the past from the royal tree. Literally, the oak, which is the royal family, coming down from Elizabeth I to Queen Elizabeth II. There is a direct link between Hatfield and the present House of Windsor.